arrows tipped with bronze, strategic military formations, layered armor, and an insatiable, cold-blooded thirst for power. These were not just tools forged in a fire. They were the primary factors that determined the end of world peace as humanity once knew it. Today, we are going to talk about how this war began. A war that, in many ways, has never truly ended, but has simply evolved with better metallurgy and faster delivery systems. Before this precise moment in the Fertile Crescent, conflict was largely tribal, sporadic, and limited by the physical exhaustion of a few dozen men. But 4,000 years ago, a single man decided that enough was a word that didn't apply to his ambitions. He didn't just want to win a local cattle raid or a border dispute. He wanted to own the very horizon itself. He invented a machine of state-sponsored violence, a blueprint for systematic conquest that we still call empire today. He was the first to realize that war wasn't a seasonal event, but a permanent industry. Imagine the fertile, sun-drenched plains of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers snakes through the dust. For centuries, independent city-states like Uruk, and Kish lived in a delicate, often tense and highly ritualized balance. They fought over precious water rights. They fought over invisible borders in the sand, but they always returned to the safety of their massive mud brick walls. There was no concept of a world power, because the world, to them, ended where their irrigation canals stopped. War was a ceremony of kings, slow and heavy. Then, from the deep shadows of a royal kitchen in the city of Kish, a commoner named Sargon emerged. The legends, later polished by his own propaganda machine, say he was a foundling, a baby left in a basket of rushes on the river, abandoned by a mother who could not keep him. It is a story so powerful and resonant of divine destiny that it would be echoed by the greatest kings and prophets for the next 3 millennia. But Sargon was not a man of divine peace. He was a man of cold, calculated observation. Sargon rose to become the cupbearer to the king of Kish, Ur-Zababa. This wasn't just a servant's job. It was a position of extreme proximity to power. He stood in the silent corners of the throne room, pouring wine while the elite discussed the old ways of war. Sargon watched with a critical eye as the traditional Sumerian warriors moved. They were impressive but archaic, heavily armored in thick cloaks, carrying massive rectangular wooden shields that required both hands to stabilize, and wielding short, heavy spears. These men were built for a static phalanx defense, a slow-moving wall of bronze and wood meant to stand its ground, not to pursue or conquer. They were a military designed for a world that stood still. Sargon, however, saw the fatal flaw in this ancient design. He realized that while the kings sat in their towering ziggurats, protected by rituals and walls, the very nature of human organization was ripe for a violent reimagining. He understood a terrifying truth that still defines modern high-tech warfare. Speed and range are more lethal than any amount of heavy bronze plating. While he served the king, Sargon was quietly studying the geography of the desert and the limitations of the city-states. He began to gather a following that was different from the traditional city levies. He didn't want farmers who fought for their homes. He wanted men who lived for the march. He was building the world's first professional military, a paramilitary force that owed loyalty not to a city-state, a god, or a tradition, but to him alone. He was recruiting from the fringes of society, the outsiders who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from a collapse of the old order. He was creating a shadow army that functioned like a surgical blade in a world of heavy hammers. When Sargon finally struck, it wasn't just a simple palace coup. It was a total and irreversible reimagining of human reality. He didn't just kill the king of Kish. He absorbed the city's entire infrastructure and immediately marched on the next target before the news of his betrayal could even travel. This was the birth of blitzkrieg in the ancient world. The Sumerian kings, who believed their sacred walls were eternal and their gods were their ultimate shield, suddenly faced something they couldn't even comprehend. An army that didn't stop to negotiate, an army that didn't go home for the harvest. Sargon introduced a weapon of high-tension engineering to the battlefield that changed the physics of death: the composite bow. Unlike the simple wooden bows of the past, this was a layered masterpiece of horn, wood, and sinew. capable of raining high-velocity arrows from distances his enemies couldn't even see, let alone reach. It was the sniper rifle of the ancient world, and in the hands of Sargon's mobile archers, it turned the heavy Sumerian phalanxes into nothing more than slow-moving targets. With every city that fell, Sargon's secret arsenal didn't just grow in numbers. It grew in technological sophistication. He wasn't just taking territory, he was harvesting the best smiths, the most innovative engineers, and the most strategic minds. He was the first to implement a standardized supply chain, ensuring his troops were fed and armed from a centralized hub, a logistical feat that was unheard of in 2300 BCE. This was the birth of the great ambition. Sargon of Akkad proved to the world that if you control the technology of death and the logistics of speed, you can dictate the terms of life itself. He replaced the chaotic, noisy rivalry of tribes with the cold, silent, and efficient machinery of a unified empire. But as Sargon stood atop the smoking ruins of the old world, a dark and heavy silence began to grow over Mesopotamia. He had unlocked a door that could never be closed again. To keep a machine of this magnitude running, you need more than just superior bows and faster chariots. You need a constant, never-ending stream of silver, resources, slaves, and above all, fear. The man who invented systematic war had inadvertently created a monster that would eventually demand his own civilization, and every civilization after it, as a final sacrifice. The age of ritualized, small-scale peace was officially over. The age of the total empire and the permanent war for resources had begun. As the dust settled over the charred gates of Kish, Sargon did not stop to celebrate. He understood a principle that would later define every superpower in history. A conquest is only as strong as the supply chain that feeds it. To maintain his grip on a fractured Mesopotamia, Sargon had to transform war from a seasonal hobby of kings into a permanent industrialized machine. He was no longer just a rebel. He was the CEO of the world's first military-industrial complex. While his enemies relied on the bravery of their citizens, Sargon relied on the cold efficiency of his engineers and the unprecedented standardization of his arsenal. The first major innovation was the professionalization of the soldier. In the Sumerian tradition, men were farmers first and warriors second. They fought when the harvest was over and returned home when the rains came. Sargon shattered this cycle. He established a standing army of 400 men who, according to ancient inscriptions, ate at his table daily. This wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was a tactical masterstroke. By keeping his core force fed and housed year-round, he ensured they were always drill-ready, always sharp, and always loyal to him personally, rather than to a distant city god. This was the birth of the professional class of war. These men didn't just know how to swing a mace, they understood the complex geometry of the battlefield, the psychological timing of a charge, and the maintenance of advanced weaponry. But a professional army is useless without superior equipment. And it was here that Sargon's secret arsenal truly deviated from history. He centralized the production of bronze. In the old world, a blacksmith made a sword for a specific noble, each blade unique and impossible to replace. Sargon's workshops in the city of Akkad began producing weapons in batches. He sought a terrifying level of uniformity. If an Akkadian archer's bow snapped in the middle of a campaign in the Zagros Mountains, he didn't have to wait for a master craftsman to build a new one from scratch. He could be issued a replacement that functioned exactly like the first. This standardization allowed for a level of logistical fluidity that made the Akkadian army feel like a single multi-headed organism. The centerpiece of this technological edge was the Sargonide composite bow. While we touched on its power, its impact on the physics of the 24th century BCE cannot be overstated. Standard Sumerian bows were simple self-bows made of a single piece of wood, which lost tension in the humidity of the river valleys and lacked the piercing power to penetrate even basic leather armor at a distance. Sargon's engineers perfected the art of tension loading. By laminating layers of animal horn on the belly of the bow and sinew on the back, they created a weapon that stored massive amounts of kinetic energy. When an Akkadian archer released his string, the arrow didn't just fly, It accelerated with a velocity that could punch through the copper-studded cloaks of the Sumerian elite from over 200 yards away. It was the first time in history that range became a decisive factor in geopolitical dominance. However, Sargon knew that range alone wouldn't hold a city. He needed a way to crack the eternal mud-brick walls that had protected Sumerian autonomy for millennia. He invested heavily in the world's first specialized siege units. Ancient reliefs suggest the use of early battering rams, massive beams of cedar tipped with heavy bronze heads slung from wooden frames to maximize momentum. But his real secret was sapper warfare. Sargon's engineers were masters of irrigation and water management. He turned that knowledge against his enemies. They would divert rivers to undermine the foundations of city walls or dig tunnels beneath the fortifications, causing entire sections of impenetrable brick to collapse into the dust. He proved that no wall is tall enough to stop a man who understands the science of the earth. To move this massive machinery of war, Sargon reimagined logistics. He created a network of royal roads, the precursors to the Roman highways, specifically designed to move troops and grain at high speeds. He implemented a system of standardized weights and measures, the Akkadian standard, not for fair trade, but to ensure that every province paid its tribute in the exact amount of copper and tin needed to keep the forges of Akkad burning. War was no longer a series of battles. It was a mathematical equation. Sargon calculated the caloric needs of his 5,400 men, the lifespan of a bronze spearhead, and the time it took for a messenger to reach the Persian Gulf. He was the first human to weaponize information. The psychological impact of this industrial war was devastating. Imagine being a Sumerian defender in the city of Umma. You have lived your whole life believing your city is the center of the universe. Then, a cloud of dust appears on the horizon. Out of that cloud comes a force that doesn't look like anything you've ever seen. They don't shout tribal war cries. They move in silent, rhythmic formations. They don't wait for your challenge. They rain arrows on you from a distance where you can't even see their faces. Your walls, which stood for 10 generations, begin to shake and crumble under the rhythmic thud of machines you don't have a name for. This wasn't war as the ancients understood it. This was a system overload. Sargon of Akkad didn't just conquer Sumer. He liquidated its identity and replaced it with a machine. He was the first to realize that the ultimate weapon isn't a sword or a bow. It is the system. By the time he reached the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, he had unified an entire region under a single terrifying military logic. But as the forges of Akkad grew hotter and the piles of tribute grew higher, the machine began to demand more. The industrialization of death had a hunger that could never be satisfied. To keep the peace, Sargon needed more war. To fund the forges, he needed more conquest. The first empire was a runaway train, powered by the very bronze and blood it was built to protect. Sargon of Akkad had achieved what no human before him dared to dream. He had unified the known world under a single bronze-fisted administration. But as his reign reached its twilight, the very system he created, the secret arsenal of standardized war, began to reveal its fatal flaw. An empire built on constant expansion is a pyramid scheme of blood. The moment it stops growing, it begins to devour itself. Sargon had transformed Mesopotamia into a high-speed engine of conquest, but he had forgotten to build a set of brakes. The great ambition was about to meet the great silence. The cracks first appeared in the logistics. To maintain a standing army of thousands, Sargon's successors had to squeeze every drop of life from the soil. The Akkadian standard of taxation became a death sentence for the Sumerian city-states. Farmers who once took pride in their irrigation canals were now nothing more than fuel for the Akkadian war machine. Environmental data from the 22nd century BCE suggests a catastrophic shift, a prolonged 300-year drought that decimated the grain production of the north. In a centralized empire, when the center starves, the periphery revolts. The royal roads that Sargon built to move his invincible archers were now being used by rebellious governors and invading Gutian tribes from the mountains. The technology of speed was now working against its creator. Then came the curse. Ancient texts, such as the Curse of Agade, speak of Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, committing the ultimate sin. the destruction of the Enlil Temple in Nippur. While historians debate the religious details, the geopolitical reality was clear. The central authority had lost its mind. Naram Sin declared himself a living god, the king of the four quarters of the world, but his secret arsenal was running dry. The tin and copper needed for bronze were becoming harder to secure as trade routes collapsed under the weight of nomadic invasions. The Akkadian army, once the pinnacle of engineering, found itself fighting with duller blades and broken bows. The industrialization of death had reached its limit. Around 2150 BCE, the unthinkable happened. Akkad, the most powerful and technologically advanced city on Earth, simply vanished from the map. History tells us it was sacked, but the destruction was so absolute that to this day, 4,000 years later, archaeologists have never found its location. It is the Atlantis of the Sands, the city that standardized the world, the hub that controlled the first professional army, was erased so thoroughly that it became a ghost story. The secret arsenal was buried, the formulas for the composite bows were lost to time, and the Akkadian standard was replaced by the chaotic silence of a dark age. But did Sargon's machine truly die? As we look at the ruins of Ur and the dust where Akkad once stood, we see a terrifying mirror. Sargon was the first to prove that superior technology and centralized logistics could overcome any tradition, any wall, and any god. He taught humanity that war is an industry that can be scaled, optimized, and perfected. Every empire that followed, from the Romans with their standardized gladius to the modern era of satellite-guided munitions, is a direct descendant of the Akkadian blueprint. We didn't move past Sargon, we just improved his materials. The legacy of the First Empire is a warning carved in clay. Sargon of Akkad proved that you can conquer the world with a secret arsenal, but you cannot sustain a civilization on the technology of death alone. The great silence of the Nile and the missing ruins of Akkad are not just historical footnotes. They are a prophecy. When a society puts all its ingenuity into the tools of destruction, it eventually loses the ability to build anything else. Today we look at the meteoritic iron daggers and the bronze arrowheads in our museums as relics of a primitive past. But if we look closer, we see the reflection of our own ambition. We are still using Sargon's roads. We are still fighting for his resources. And as the shadows grow long over our own modern secret arsenals, we must ask ourselves, are we heading toward a new golden age, or are we just preparing for our own great silence? The man who invented war left us the blueprints for the end of the world. It's up to us to decide if we will continue to follow them.